In the gleaming boardroom of Morrison Group's headquarters, a young compliance analyst was about to deliver findings that would shake the corporate world. What started as a routine audit presentation took a shocking turn when they came face to face with the CEO's daughter's venomous contempt. Chen wasn't your typical corporate whistleblower. For 3 years, she had spent her life meticulously tracking financial irregularities, known for her unwavering integrity and razor-sharp analytical mind. When she encountered Victoria Morrison's cruel dismissal and discovered the web of corruption beneath, she had no idea she was walking into a battle that would cost her everything and change her forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The 43rd floor of Morrison & Associates never slept. But at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday in October, Emma Richardson was its only occupant. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a commanding view of Manhattan's financial district, where scattered office lights twinkled like distant stars against the darkness. Emma barely noticed. Her attention remained fixed on the dual monitors displaying spreadsheets that would have made most people's eyes glaze over. But to her, they told stories. Stories that tonight were beginning to whisper secrets she wished she couldn't understand. The Yamamoto merger documents sprawled across her desk in meticulous piles, each stack representing months of due diligence for what would be Morrison & Associates' largest acquisition to date. Emma had volunteered to handle the final review, partly because she thrived on the intricate puzzle of corporate finance, and partly because the overtime pay helped chip away at her mother's medical bills back in Akron. She took a sip of her 4th coffee of the evening, the bitter liquid now cold, and clicked to the next tab of client account transfers. The number stopped her mid-swallow. $2, $3 million transferred from the Yamamoto escrow account to a shell company called Meridian Holdings. She frowned, cross-referencing the transaction against her notes. Meridian wasn't mentioned anywhere in the merger documentation. Emma's fingers flew across the keyboard, pulling up the company's registration details. Delaware Incorporation, minimal public filings, and a registered address that looked suspiciously like a mail forwarding service. Her pulse quickened. In the 3 years since joining Morrison & Associates, fresh from Northwestern's MBA program, Emma had developed an instinct for financial irregularities. Growing up watching her father pore over factory safety reports at their kitchen table had taught her that details mattered, and that powerful people often hid dangerous truths in plain sight. She pulled up the broader client account database, searching for other transactions involving Meridian Holdings. What she found made her stomach clench. Over the past 18 months, 17 different client accounts had transferred funds to Meridian, totaling $47. $8 million. The amounts varied, some as small as $100,000, others exceeding $5 million, but the pattern was unmistakable. Money was being systematically siphoned from client escrow accounts and funneled to this mysterious shell company. Emma leaned back in her ergonomic chair, a hand-me-down from a senior analyst who'd been promoted to the London office. The chair creaked slightly, a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the empty office. She thought of her father, Thomas Richardson, and the countless nights he'd spent at their scarred wooden table, reviewing safety protocols and incident reports for the Buckeye manufacturing plant where he worked as a floor supervisor. "Numbers don't lie, Emmy," he used to say, adjusting his reading glasses as he traced columns of data with a calloused finger. "People lie. Executives lie. But numbers? They tell the truth, even when nobody wants to hear it." Thomas Richardson had died when Emma was a junior in college, crushed by a hydraulic press that should have been serviced months earlier. The plant's parent company, Consolidated Industries, had deferred the maintenance to boost quarterly profits. The wrongful death settlement barely covered his funeral expenses, and Emma's mother still struggled with the medical bills from his final week in intensive care. That tragedy had crystallized Emma's purpose: to use her analytical skills to hold corporations accountable, to be the person who caught the dangerous shortcuts and financial manipulations before they destroyed lives. It's why she'd chosen Morrison & Associates over flashier investment banks. Their reputation for ethical practices and thorough due diligence had seemed aligned with her values. Now, staring at evidence of systematic embezzlement, she felt that foundation cracking beneath her feet. Emma pulled up Meridian Holdings' bank routing information and cross-referenced it against Morrison & Associates' corporate accounts. Her breathing grew shallow as the connections became clear. The shell company's primary account was held at the same private bank Richard Morrison used for his personal finances. She found property purchase records showing Meridian had bought Richard Morrison's Hamptons estate for $12 million, a transaction that allowed Morrison to claim the sale while maintaining control through the shell company. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened Morrison's expense reports, comparing dates and amounts. Victoria Morrison's rehab stint in Switzerland, $800,000 from client funds 2 days before the facility's payment was due. James Morrison's children's private school tuition, $150,000 transferred the same week the school sent past due notices. The family's charitable foundation donations, millions in client money used to buy social status and tax write-offs. The scope was staggering. This wasn't opportunistic theft. It was a systematic looting operation that had been running for years. Emma calculated the total, nearly $200 million stolen from clients who trusted Morrison & Associates with their most significant financial transactions. She needed more evidence. Moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd spent countless late nights in empty offices, Emma began copying files to an encrypted drive. Bank statements, wire transfer authorizations, email correspondence. She documented everything, creating a digital trail that would be impossible to dismiss or destroy. As she worked, Emma discovered an email thread between Richard and James Morrison from 6 months earlier. The subject line read, "Meridian Adjustments," and Richard's message was brief but damning. "Jimmy, need you to adjust the Meridian transfers to spread them across more accounts. SEC is sniffing around some of our competitors. Time to be more careful about covering tracks. R." James's response was even more revealing. "Already working on it. Moved the Patterson account funds through 3 intermediaries before the final transfer. But Richard, this is getting harder to hide. Maybe we should consider scaling back." Richard's reply chilled Emma to the bone. "Absolutely not. We're too close to the pension fund acquisition. That's $2 billion in assets we can access. A few more months and we'll be set for life. Just keep your nerve, brother." Emma sat in the glowing blue light of her monitors, processing the magnitude of what she'd uncovered. This wasn't just about the Yamamoto merger, or even Morrison & Associates. The pension fund acquisition Richard mentioned would give them access to retirement savings for thousands of teachers, firefighters, and municipal employees. People like her father, who'd worked their entire lives believing their pensions would provide security in old age. The weight of responsibility settled on her shoulders like a lead blanket. She thought of her father's words about numbers telling the truth, even when nobody wanted to hear it. But she also thought about what happened to people who told inconvenient truths to powerful men. Thomas Richardson had died because executives chose profits over safety. How many others would suffer if she stayed silent about the Morrison family's crimes? Emma glanced at the time. 2:14 a.m. The city below had grown quieter, but her mind raced with possibilities and fears. She carefully labeled each copied file and stored the encrypted drive in her purse, then began the methodical process of closing documents and clearing her browser history. But as she prepared to leave, one final discovery stopped her cold. In Richard Morrison's sent folder, she found an email to a private investigation firm dated just 2 weeks earlier. The message was brief. "Need full background workup on Emma Richardson, financial analyst. Particularly interested in any vulnerabilities or pressure points we can leverage if necessary." The implications hit her like a physical blow. Morrison suspected her. Somehow, despite her careful discretion, he knew she was getting close to something. The investigation into her background meant they were already preparing to destroy her if she became a threat. Emma's reflection stared back at her from the darkened window. A young woman from Ohio who'd thought she could change the world through spreadsheets and integrity. But she wasn't naive enough to believe that good intentions would protect her from the Morrison family's wrath. She'd seen what happened to whistleblowers, how they were professionally destroyed and personally attacked until they disappeared into obscurity. Yet, as she gathered her things and prepared to leave the office, Emma found herself thinking not of her own safety, but of the thousands of pension recipients who would lose everything if Richard Morrison succeeded in his plan. She thought of her father, and of the promise she'd made at his graveside to never let corporate criminals hide behind balance sheets and boardroom doors. The elevator descended through the sleeping floors of Morrison and Associates, carrying Emma toward a choice. That would change everything. In her purse, the encrypted drive felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. She had the evidence to bring down one of Manhattan's most powerful financial empires, but using it would make her a target of forces she barely understood. As the elevator reached the lobby and its doors slid open with a soft chime, Emma Richardson stepped into the marble atrium that had once represented the pinnacle of her professional aspirations. Now it felt like a mausoleum, a monument to the corruption that festered beneath Wall Street's polished surface. The security guard nodded as she badged out, unaware that the young woman walking past his desk carried the power to topple the very building they stood in. Emma emerged onto the empty street, where the October wind cut through her wool coat and carried the promise of winter. She had until morning to decide whether to destroy Richard Morrison's empire or pretend she'd never seen the truth hidden in those numbers. But as she walked toward the subway station, Emma already knew her choice had been made the moment she'd seen her father's values reflected in columns of stolen money. The numbers didn't lie, and neither would she. Emma arrived at the Morrison and Associates conference room 15 minutes early, her leather portfolio containing meticulously prepared financial projections for the Nakamura Industries merger. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a commanding view of downtown Seattle, where morning fog still clung to the sound. She arranged her materials with practiced precision, knowing that today's presentation could make or break the $2. $3 billion, deal that would cement Morrison and Associates' reputation in the Pacific Rim market. The Japanese delegation entered promptly at 9 o'clock, led by Hiroshi Nakamura himself, a silver-haired titan of industry, whose company had built half of Tokyo's skyline. Emma rose respectfully, offering a slight bow that she'd practiced the night before. Nakamura's team of 6 executives followed suit, their movements synchronized with the quiet efficiency that had made Japanese corporations legendary. Richard. Morrison swept in moments later, his trademark confident smile firmly in place. "Gentlemen, welcome to Seattle. I trust your flight was comfortable?" His handshake was firm, his eye contact unwavering. The performance of a man who'd built an empire on the strength of his presence alone. "Where is Victoria-san?" Nakamura inquired politely, consulting his gold watch. "We were told she would be presenting the financial overview." Richard's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "She'll be here momentarily. You know how thorough she is, probably reviewing the numbers one final time." Emma felt a familiar knot form in her stomach. Victoria's car wasn't in the parking garage, and her assistant had mentioned something about a late night at the Fairmont Olympics penthouse suite. Through her investigations, Emma had learned that Victoria's late nights increasingly involved pharmaceutical enhancement and the sort of company that money could buy, but respectability couldn't. 23 minutes past 9, Victoria finally appeared. Emma's breath caught in her throat. Victoria's normally immaculate blonde hair was pulled back in a messy bun, revealing the telltale glassiness of dilated pupils. Her Hermes blazer was wrinkled, and there was a coffee stain on her silk blouse that she'd attempted to cover with a strategically placed scarf. But it was the slight tremor in her hands and the overly bright smile that confirmed Emma's worst fears. "Gentlemen, so sorry to keep you waiting," Victoria announced. her voice carrying the artificially enthusiastic tone that Emma recognized from their previous encounters. Traffic was absolutely brutal this morning. Nakamura's expression remained diplomatically neutral, but Emma caught the subtle exchange of glances between the Japanese executives. In their culture, punctuality wasn't just courtesy, it was respect. Victoria had already insulted them without realizing it. "Shall we begin?" Richard interjected smoothly, though Emma noticed the muscle twitching in his temple. "Victoria, why don't you walk our friends through the financial projections?" Victoria fumbled with her laptop, taking 3 attempts to connect it to the projection system. When the slides finally appeared, Emma immediately spotted the error. In Victoria's altered state, she'd confused the quarterly projections with annual figures, a mistake that inflated their company's performance by 400%. "As you can see," Victoria continued, her voice gaining confidence as she warmed to her performance, "Morrison & Associates has achieved unprecedented growth with quarterly revenues of $847 million. Emma's heart sank. The actual quarterly figure was $212 million. Still impressive, but nowhere near Victoria's claim. She glanced at Nakamura, whose eyebrows had risen slightly. As the head of a multinational corporation, he would recognize impossible numbers when he heard them. "These projections," Victoria pressed on, seemingly oblivious to her audience's growing skepticism, "demonstrate our capacity to triple the value of your North American investments within 18 months. Emma found herself in an impossible position. Remain silent and watch the deal collapse when Nakamura's team inevitably discovered the discrepancy, or speak up and potentially save the merger while risking Victoria's wrath. The weight of 47 jobs hung in the balance. Colleagues who had families, mortgages, dreams that depended on Morrison & Associates' continued success. She cleared her throat softly. "Excuse me, Victoria. I believe there might be a small error in those figures." The room fell silent. Victoria's head snapped toward Emma with the predatory focus of a hawk spotting movement in tall grass. "I'm sorry." Victoria's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. "Did you just interrupt me?" Emma's training in corporate diplomacy kicked in. "I simply wanted to clarify that the $847 million figure represents our annual projection, not quarterly. Our actual quarterly revenue is $212 million, which still represents a 23% increase over last year." Victoria's face underwent a transformation that Emma would remember for the rest of her life. The artificial sweetness melted away, replaced by something cold and vicious. "How dare you?" Victoria hissed, rising from her chair with such force that it rolled backward and struck the wall. "How dare you contradict me in front of our clients?" Nakamura shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His executives had gone completely still, their training in reading corporate dynamics telling them that they were witnessing something far more significant than a simple disagreement over numbers. "Victoria, please," Richard began, but his daughter was beyond restraint. "Do you know who you're talking to?" Victoria's voice rose with each word, her carefully constructed facade crumbling entirely. "I am the vice president of this company. I am a Morrison. You are nothing but poverty trash that we hired out of pity." The words hit Emma like physical blows. Around the table, 6 of Japan's most powerful executives watched in stunned silence as the woman who was supposed to represent Morrison & Associates' future revealed her true character. "You have no right," Victoria continued, now addressing the room as much as Emma, "to speak in the presence of real money. You don't belong here. You never belonged here. You're just a charity case from some pathetic state school who somehow managed to fool people into thinking you matter." Emma felt heat flood her cheeks, but she remained motionless. Years of swallowing insults, of accepting lesser treatment, of telling herself that endurance was a virtue, had prepared her for this moment. She would not give Victoria the satisfaction of seeing her break. "That's enough," Richard finally intervened, but his voice lacked conviction. Emma realized with crystalline clarity that he was more concerned about the scene than the cruelty. Victoria wasn't finished. "Look at you," she sneered, gesturing dismissively at Emma's modest business attire. "Wearing your little clearance rack outfit, thinking you can correct your betters. You're nobody. You'll always be nobody. And the sooner you accept that, the sooner you can go back to whatever trailer park you crawled out of." The silence that followed was deafening. Emma could hear the mechanical hum of the air conditioning, the distant sound of traffic 40 floors below, the rapid beating of her own heart. But she remained perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, her expression composed. Nakamura cleared his throat. "Perhaps," he said carefully, "we should reschedule this meeting. We seem to have caught you at an inopportune time." Richard's face had gone ashen. In the span of 5 minutes, Victoria had destroyed months of careful relationship building and potentially cost the company its biggest deal of the decade. "Emma," Richard said quietly, not meeting her eyes, "I think it would be best if you gathered your materials and took the rest of the day." The dismissal was the final insult. After being publicly humiliated for telling the truth, after maintaining her professionalism while being called poverty trash, Emma was being sent away like a scolded child. She rose with careful dignity, collected her portfolio, and walked toward the door. As she reached for the handle, she heard Nakamura address Richard in clipped tones. "Morrison-san, we will need to discuss whether Morrison and Associates possesses the corporate culture that Nakamura Industries requires in a partner." Emma closed the door behind her and walked to the elevator on unsteady legs. It wasn't until she reached her car in the parking garage that the full weight of what had happened crashed over her. Sitting behind the wheel of her modest Honda Civic, surrounded by the BMWs and Mercedes that filled the executive spaces, Emma finally allowed herself to feel the rage that she'd suppressed in the conference room. It burned through her chest like acid, years of accumulated injustice finally finding an outlet. Victoria Morrison had just made the biggest mistake of her privileged life. She had pushed Emma past the breaking point, past the place where caution and career preservation mattered more than justice. Emma reached into her portfolio and withdrew the USB drive containing months of evidence, financial records, email transcripts, documented patterns of fraud and embezzlement. Until this morning, she'd been paralyzed by the magnitude of what exposure would mean, by the certainty that taking on the Morrisons would destroy her career. But career destruction seemed insignificant compared to the fire burning in her chest. Victoria had stripped away Emma's last illusion about working within the system, about earning respect through competence and dedication. As she drove out of the garage, Emma made a decision that would change everything. She would no longer be the Morrison family's victim. She would become their reckoning. The humiliation was complete, but so was her transformation. Emma Sullivan was done being underestimated. Emma spent the weekend in her Capitol Hill apartment, poring over the evidence she'd accumulated like a general planning a siege. The USB drive's contents sprawled across her dining table. Printed emails, financial records, photographs of documents she'd discreetly captured. Each piece told part of a larger story, the Morrison family's systematic looting of their own company. But evidence without allies was just paper. Taking on Seattle's most powerful family would require more than moral outrage and a flash drive. Emma needed people with credibility, connections, and the courage to stand against the Morrison machine. Monday morning arrived gray and drizzling, typical for October in Seattle. Emma dressed carefully in her most professional attire, a navy blue suit that projected competence despite its department store origins. Today would determine whether she faced the Morrisons alone or with backup. Her first stop was the 23rd floor of the Columbia Center, where Marcus Chen had built his reputation as Seattle's most feared corporate whistleblower attorney. His waiting room spoke of success, leather furniture, original art, and a view that commanded half the city. Emma's modest appearance drew curious glances from the receptionist, but Marcus had agreed to see her based on a single phone call mentioning Morrison and Associates. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Ms. Sullivan, Marcus greeted her with a firm handshake. At 45, he possessed the lean intensity of a distance runner and the sharp eyes of someone who'd made his career dismantling corporate lies. Tell me about the Morrisons. Emma had rehearsed this moment, but sitting across from Marcus, she felt the weight of what she was about to unleash. They're stealing from their own company, millions of dollars systematically over the past 3 years. She opened her portfolio and began laying out the evidence. Marcus listened without interruption, occasionally requesting clarification or asking her to expand on particular transactions. His expression remained neutral, but Emma caught the slight tightening around his eyes when she showed him Victoria's personal expense account. "This is substantial," Marcus finally said, leaning back in his chair. "But prosecuting the Morrisons won't be like taking down some mid-level executive. Richard Morrison has been building political capital in this city for 20 years. He sits on the boards of Seattle General, the Symphony, and the Maritime Museum. Victoria chairs the Children's Hospital Fundraising Committee. Are you saying we can't win? I'm saying we need to be strategic. The Morrisons will deploy every weapon they have, legal, financial, and social. They'll investigate your background, challenge your credibility, and make your life very difficult." Marcus paused, studying her face. "The question is, are you prepared for that kind of fight?" Emma thought of Victoria's sneer, the word poverty trash echoing in her memory. "I'm prepared." "Good, because I'll need more than just financial evidence. I need someone inside Morrison and Associates who can corroborate your story. Someone with enough standing that the prosecutors can't dismiss them as a disgruntled employee." Emma's heart sank. "Most people there are terrified of crossing the Morrisons. Their jobs, their careers. There's always someone," Marcus interrupted. "Someone who's seen too much, someone with their own grievances. You just need to know where to look." Leaving Marcus's office, Emma felt both energized and daunted. She had a lawyer, but she needed an insider. Walking through downtown Seattle, she considered her colleagues at Morrison and Associates. Most were too junior, too scared, or too invested in the company's success to risk everything on a whistleblower case. Then she remembered David Park. David was Morrison and Associates' IT director, a quiet man in his 50s who'd been with the company for 12 years. Emma had noticed him watching Victoria with barely concealed disgust during company meetings, his jaw tightening whenever she spoke. More importantly, as IT director, David had access to everything: email systems, financial databases, communication logs. That evening, Emma waited in the parking garage until David emerged from the elevator. She approached him carefully, knowing that this conversation would determine whether she had an ally or a potential enemy. "David, could I speak with you for a moment?" He looked surprised but nodded. "Sure, Emma. What's on your mind?" "I need to ask you something confidential, about the company, about the Morrisons." David's expression shifted, becoming guarded. "What kind of question?" Emma took a breath. "Have you ever noticed anything unusual about the company's financial systems? Transactions that didn't make sense?" For a long moment, David said, "Nothing." Then quietly, "Follow me." They walked to his car, a sensible Toyota that reflected his practical nature. Once inside, David turned to face her. "You're talking about the shell companies," he said simply. Emma's pulse quickened. "You know about them?" "I maintain the servers that process the transactions. I've watched millions of dollars flow through entities that exist only on paper. Victoria thinks she's clever, but she leaves digital footprints everywhere." David's voice carried years of suppressed frustration. The question is, what are you planning to do about it? I'm going to expose them. I have a lawyer, evidence, but I need someone who can verify the technical aspects, someone who can't be dismissed as having an axe to grind. David was quiet for several minutes, staring through the windshield at the city lights reflecting off Elliott Bay. Finally, he spoke. 3 years ago, Victoria fired my assistant. Janet was a single mother, worked nights to put herself through college, graduated with honors. But she made the mistake of questioning a software purchase that seemed excessive. Victoria called her intellectually inadequate and had her escorted out the same day. Emma waited, sensing there was more. Last year, I watched them destroy the pension fund, moved the money to high-risk investments managed by Victoria's college roommate. When it lost 30% in 6 months, they covered it up by shifting funds from other accounts. That's someone's retirement, Emma. That's people who trusted this company with their futures. Will you help me? David looked at her with tired eyes. I've been waiting 3 years for someone to ask me that question. Yes, I'll help you. But we need to be smart about this. The Morrisons have destroyed people for less. Over the next hour, sitting in David's car in the shadowy parking garage, they outlined their strategy. David would copy the server logs and financial databases onto encrypted drives, providing the technical evidence that would make the case bulletproof. Emma would coordinate with Marcus Chen and begin building the legal framework for their assault on the Morrison empire. There's one more thing, David said as they prepared to leave. Richard Morrison isn't just stealing from the company. He's been taking money from the charitable foundation, the one that's supposed to fund scholarships for underprivileged kids. If we're going to destroy him, we might as well do it completely. Emma felt a cold fury settle in her chest. Not content with looting their own company, the Morrisons had stolen from children who depended on those scholarships. Kids like she had been, fighting for every opportunity. Get me everything, she said quietly. Every transaction, every email, every digital trace. We're going to burn their empire to the ground. As they parted ways, Emma realized that the scared, cautious woman who'd walked into that meeting 3 days ago was gone forever. In her place stood someone harder, more determined, and infinitely more dangerous to the Morrison family. The humiliation had been complete, but so was her transformation. Emma Sullivan was no longer fighting just for justice. She was fighting for war. The Seattle FBI field office occupied an unremarkable building in the International District, its gray facade concealing the federal machinery that could dismantle corporate empires. Emma sat in the sterile waiting room, her hands steady despite the enormity of what she was about to unleash. Beside her, Marcus Chen reviewed their presentation one final time, while David Park clutched an encrypted hard drive containing 3 years of digital evidence. Remember, Marcus whispered, stick to the facts. Let the evidence speak. Special. Agent Sarah Martinez appeared precisely at their scheduled time, her dark suit and no-nonsense demeanor projecting the authority of someone who'd built her career prosecuting white-collar crime. At 38, she possessed a reputation for taking down Seattle's untouchables, politicians, tech executives, and now, potentially, the Morrison family. Ms. Sullivan, Agent Martinez began, settling into her chair across the conference table. Mr. Chen indicated you have information regarding financial irregularities at Morrison & Associates. I should warn you that we take false accusations very seriously, particularly against prominent citizens. Emma opened her portfolio, the same leather folder that had witnessed her humiliation just 2 weeks earlier. Now it contained the instruments of the Morrisons' destruction. Agent Martinez, Morrison & Associates has been operating as a front for systematic embezzlement. Richard and Victoria Morrison have stolen approximately $47 million from their own company over the past 3 years. She laid out the first document, bank transfers showing money flowing from Morrison & Associates to shell companies controlled by the Morrison family. Agent Martinez's expression remained neutral, but Emma caught the slight forward lean that indicated professional interest. These entities, Emma continued, pointing to a series of transactions, exist only on paper. Cascade Holdings, Pacific Rim Consulting, Northwest Development, all registered to addresses that turn out to be empty offices. The money flows in, gets moved through several accounts, and emerges in Richard Morrison's personal investment portfolio. David stepped forward, connecting his laptop to the room's projection system. I can show you the digital trail. Every transaction, every email authorization, every attempt to cover their tracks. The next 40 minutes transformed the sterile conference room into a war room. David's technical expertise brought the crimes to life. Screenshots of Victoria's emails discussing creative accounting, server logs showing backdated transactions, digital signatures proving authorization for fraudulent transfers. Agent Martinez took notes but said nothing, her poker face revealing no hint of her thoughts. Emma began to worry that they'd miscalculated, that the Morrisons' reputation provided armor against even damning evidence. Then Emma revealed the charity fraud. The Morrison Family Foundation, she said, producing tax documents and bank statements, claims to provide scholarships for underprivileged students. They raised $3 million last year through galas and corporate donations. Of that money, exactly $127,000 went to actual scholarships. Agent Martinez's pen stopped moving. Where did the rest go? Victoria's lifestyle, Richard's art collection, a $400,000 yacht that's registered to one of their shell companies, but moored at the Seattle Yacht Club under Richard's name. David pulled up photographs, the yacht, invoices for Victoria's shopping sprees charged to the foundation, receipts for Richard's wine collection purchased with money intended for children's education. These families, Emma's voice carried, controlled fury, trusted the Morrisons with their dreams, parents working double shifts, believing their donations would give their kids the opportunities they never had. Instead, the money paid for Victoria's cocaine habit and Richard's midlife crisis. For the first time, Agent Martinez showed emotion, a tightening around her eyes that suggested personal connection to the crimes they were describing. Ms. Sullivan, the agent said carefully, these are serious allegations. If proven, they represent multiple federal crimes: wire fraud, tax evasion, conspiracy. The penalties would be severe. We understand the gravity, Marcus interjected. That's why we've been so thorough in documenting everything. Agent Martinez leaned back, studying the three conspirators. What triggered this investigation? Why now? Emma had prepared for this question, knowing that her personal motivations could undermine their credibility. But in this sterile room, surrounded by evidence of the Morrisons' crimes, she decided on absolute truth. Victoria Morrison called me poverty trash in front of Japanese investors. She said I had no right to speak in the presence of real money, that I should go back to whatever trailer park I crawled out of. All because I professionally corrected a financial error she'd made while under the influence. Agent Martinez raised an eyebrow. You're pursuing federal charges because of a personal insult? No, Emma replied firmly. I'm pursuing federal charges because the Morrisons are criminals who've been stealing from their own company and from children who need scholarships. The insult just opened my eyes to who they really are beneath the charity galas and society pages. David spoke up. Agent Martinez, I've worked in corporate IT for 20 years. I've seen plenty of creative accounting, but this is different. The Morrisons aren't just cutting corners. They're running a criminal enterprise disguised as a legitimate business. Agent Martinez closed her notebook. I'll need copies of everything. All documents, all digital evidence, all supporting materials. We'll conduct our own investigation, interview witnesses, verify your claims. How long? Marcus asked. Complex financial crimes take time to unravel properly. Months, possibly longer. The Morrisons will hire the best defense attorneys money can buy. They'll challenge every piece of evidence, attack every witness. Are you prepared for that level of scrutiny? Emma thought of Victoria's sneer, of the families whose scholarship money had bought designer handbags, of the employees whose pension funds had been gambled away. Agent Martinez, I've spent my entire career being told I don't belong, that I'm not good enough, that I should be grateful for whatever scraps fall from the table. The Morrisons took my dignity, but they also made a mistake. They showed me exactly who they are. She stood, gathering her materials with practiced efficiency. I'm not just prepared for their scrutiny, I'm counting on it. Because every lawyer they hire, every investigator they unleash, every dirty trick they employ will just prove what we already know, that they're exactly the kind of people who would steal from children's scholarship funds and call it business. Agent Martinez stood as well, extending her hand. Ms. Sullivan, Mr. Park, Mr. Chen, you've presented compelling evidence. We'll be in touch within the week to begin formal proceedings. Walking out of the FBI building into the drizzling Seattle afternoon, Emma felt lighter than she had in years. The evidence was in federal hands now, beyond the reach of Morrison money and influence. How do you feel? David asked as they stood on the sidewalk. Emma looked up at the gray sky, breathing deeply of the rain-washed air. Like I just lit a fuse on a very large bomb, she said quietly. And I can't wait to watch it explode. The FBI raid began at dawn on a Tuesday morning, federal agents swarming the Morrison and Associates building like antibodies attacking an infection. From her apartment window 12 blocks away, Emma watched the news helicopters circling downtown Seattle, their cameras capturing the end of an empire. Her phone had been ringing since 6 a.m. Reporters, former colleagues, curiosity seekers who'd somehow obtained her number. She ignored them all, instead watching CNN's breaking news coverage with the detached fascination of someone witnessing their own revenge unfold in real time. Federal agents are executing search warrants at Morrison and Associates, one of Seattle's most prestigious investment firms, the reporter announced over footage of agents carrying boxes from the building. Sources indicate this is part of a major white-collar crime investigation. Emma's doorbell rang at precisely 10 o'clock. Through the peephole, she saw Richard Morrison standing in her hallway, flanked by two men in expensive suits who could only be attorneys. His usual commanding presence had been replaced by something desperate and dangerous. She opened the door but left the chain engaged, a barrier that seemed pathetically thin against the fury radiating from Seattle's former golden boy. You destroyed everything, Richard said quietly, his voice carrying more menace than if he'd shouted. 25 years building this company, and you destroyed it in one morning. You destroyed it yourself, Emma replied, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. I just documented what you'd already done. One of the attorneys stepped forward. Ms. Sullivan, I'm James Whitman from Crenshaw and Associates. We represent Mr. Morrison. Perhaps we could discuss this situation rationally, find a mutually beneficial resolution. Emma recognized the name. Crenshaw and Associates was Seattle's most prestigious white-shoe law firm, the kind that charged $1,000 an hour to make problems disappear. The fact that they were standing in her modest hallway meant the Morrisons were taking her seriously for the first time. There's nothing to discuss, Emma said. The FBI has the evidence. What happens next is up to them. Richard's composure finally cracked. Do you have any idea what you've done? 47 people are going to lose their jobs because of your vindictive little crusade. Families with mortgages, children in college. Their lives are ruined because you couldn't handle a few harsh words. Those same people you're suddenly concerned about? You stole their pension funds. You gambled with their retirement money and lost 30% of it. When they couldn't make their mortgage payments or afford their children's tuition, where was your concern then? The second attorney, a thin man with calculating eyes, produced a tablet. Ms. Sullivan, we've conducted Some research into your background, your mother's medical bills, your student loans, your rather modest living situation. We're prepared to offer substantial compensation for your cooperation in resolving this misunderstanding." Emma laughed, a sound sharp enough to cut glass. "You want to bribe me? After everything you've done, you think this is about money?" "Everything is about money," Richard snapped, his mask of civility finally falling away completely. "You think you're some crusader for justice, but you're just a bitter little nobody who couldn't handle being put in her place." Emma closed the door, removed the chain, and opened it wide. Standing face to face with Richard Morrison, she felt none of the intimidation that had paralyzed her for years. Instead, she felt the cold satisfaction of watching a predator finally cornered. "You're right about one thing," she said quietly. "I am nobody. I'm nobody from a trailer park in Oregon whose mother died because she couldn't afford proper medical care. I'm nobody who worked 3 jobs to put myself through college. I'm nobody who believed that competence and integrity mattered in the business world." She stepped closer, forcing Richard to step back. "But being nobody gave me something you'll never have. The ability to see exactly who you are. Not the charitable foundation board member or the society page philanthropist, but the man who steals from children's scholarship funds to buy his daughter cocaine and his wife jewelry." Richard's face had gone white with rage. "You have no idea who you're dealing with. I have resources, connections, influence that you can't even comprehend. I will destroy you. I will make sure you never work in this city again. Never." "Richard," Emma interrupted, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had already won, "turn on the news." The attorneys exchanged glances, one of them checking his phone. His face went pale. "Sir," the thin attorney whispered urgently, "we need to leave. Now." But Richard was beyond listening, consumed by the rage of a man watching his world collapse. "You think this is over? You think because you got lucky with some federal bureaucrat that you've won? I'll spend every dollar I have to—" "To what?" Emma asked. "Buy your way out of federal prison? The FBI doesn't care about your charity galas or your yacht club memberships. They care about evidence, and I gave them 3 years' worth." Her phone buzzed with a text message. She glanced at it and smiled. "That's my attorney. Victoria was just arrested at SeaTac trying to board a flight to Switzerland. Apparently, she had $2, $3 million in bearer bonds and a passport under a different name." The color drained from Richard's face as the implications hit him. His daughter's flight attempt would be seen as consciousness of guilt, evidence of a criminal conspiracy that no amount of legal maneuvering could explain away. James Whitman grabbed Richard's arm. "We're leaving. Now. Don't say another word." As they retreated toward the elevator, Richard turned back one final time. "This isn't over," he said, but the words carried no conviction, only the desperate bluster of a man watching his empire burn. Emma watched them disappear into the elevator, then closed her door and turned on the television. The coverage had expanded. Footage of Victoria in handcuffs, federal agents loading boxes of evidence into trucks, financial experts explaining the scope of the alleged crimes. Her phone rang again. This time she answered. "Emma, it's Marcus. Are you watching the news?" "Every channel." "Good. The FBI wants to debrief you this afternoon. Go over your testimony for the grand jury proceedings." "How are you holding up?" Emma looked around her small apartment, the same place where she'd lived in obscurity for 3 years, where she'd endured the Morrisons' contempt in silence, where she'd finally decided that dignity was worth more than security. "I'm perfect," she said, and for the first time in years she meant it. Outside her window, Seattle continued its daily rhythm, unaware that its most prominent family had just learned a fundamental truth that Emma had always known. In the end, nobody stays nobody forever. 6 months later, Emma stood in the witness box of the federal courthouse, her hand resting on the Bible as she prepared to deliver the testimony that would seal the Morrison family's fate. The courtroom was packed with reporters, former colleagues, and curious spectators drawn by what the Seattle Times had dubbed the trial of the decade. Richard Morrison sat at the defense table, his once commanding presence diminished by an orange jumpsuit and the weight of 17 federal charges. Beside him, Victoria slumped in her chair, her designer wardrobe replaced by standard court attire, her previous arrogance transformed into hollow-eyed resignation. "Ms. Sullivan," the prosecutor began, "please tell the court how you first became aware of irregularities at Morrison and Associates." Emma's voice was steady, professional, carrying none of the tremor that had once accompanied her interactions with the Morrison family. Over the next 3 hours, she methodically dismantled their empire, explaining the shell companies, the charity fraud, the pension fund theft with the precision of someone who had lived inside their criminal enterprise. When Richard's attorney cross-examined her, attempting to portray her as a vindictive employee seeking revenge, Emma met each attack with calm professionalism. "Ms. Sullivan, isn't it true that you pursued this investigation only after Ms. Morrison hurt your feelings during a business meeting?" "No," Emma replied firmly. "I pursued this investigation after witnessing Victoria Morrison steal money meant for children's scholarships to fund her drug habit. The personal insult simply made me realize that remaining silent made me complicit in their crimes." The jury's faces told the story. 12 citizens who understood the difference between wounded pride and moral obligation. The trial lasted 6 weeks. Richard Morrison was convicted on all counts, sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. Victoria received 12 years, her cooperation in exposing additional shell companies earning her a reduced sentence. The Morrison Family Foundation was ordered to pay $7 million in restitution to the scholarship program, while Morrison and Associates was liquidated to compensate defrauded investors. Emma had expected to feel triumphant when the verdicts were read. Instead, she felt only a quiet satisfaction, the kind that comes from completing a necessary but unpleasant task. The professional aftermath proved more complex than the legal resolution. Emma had become Seattle's most famous whistleblower. Her story featured in newspapers across the country. The attention brought opportunities, job offers from competing firms, speaking engagements, book deals, but also complications she hadn't anticipated. Whistleblower fatigue, Marcus Chen called it during one of their post-trial meetings. Everyone wants to hire the person who brought down the Morrisons, but nobody wants to work alongside someone who might expose their own irregularities. Emma discovered the truth of his observation over the following months. Interviews that began enthusiastically would cool when executives realized they were sitting across from someone who had destroyed her previous employers. The professional world, she learned, valued loyalty above justice, even when that loyalty protected criminals. But unexpected doors opened as well. The FBI offered her a position as a financial crimes investigator, recognizing her talent for unraveling complex corporate fraud. Seattle University's business school invited her to develop their ethics curriculum. The state attorney general's office created a new position specifically for her. Director of Corporate Accountability, tasked with investigating financial crimes that traditional law enforcement lacked the expertise to pursue. Emma chose the Attorney General's office, drawn by the opportunity to prevent other families from experiencing what the Morrison Scholarship recipients had endured. Her first case involved a tech startup that had raised $30 million in venture capital while secretly funneling funds to the founder's personal accounts. Her second targeted a construction company that had been skimming from low-income housing projects, literally stealing from the homeless. David Park joined her team 6 months later, his technical expertise proving invaluable in tracing digital financial crimes. Together, they built a reputation for thoroughness and integrity that made white-collar criminals across the Pacific Northwest extremely nervous. "Do you ever regret it?" David asked one evening as they worked late on a particularly complex case involving healthcare fraud, giving up the private sector money for government work. Emma looked around her modest office in the State Building. Government-issued furniture, fluorescent lighting, a view of the parking lot rather than Elliott Bay. Her salary was a fraction of what she could have earned in private practice, but her work felt meaningful in ways that corporate consulting never had. "Never," she said simply. "For the first time in my career, I'm not wondering whether my boss is stealing from clients or if my colleagues are cooking the books. I sleep well at night." A year after the trial, Emma received an unexpected visitor. Maria Santos, a young Latina woman wearing a graduation cap and gown, appeared in her office carrying a bouquet of flowers. "Ms. Sullivan, I'm Maria Santos. I received a Morrison Family Foundation scholarship 5 years ago, back when it was still legitimate. That money paid for my accounting degree. I graduated yesterday." Emma felt tears prick her eyes as Maria continued. "My mother cleaned offices at night to support us. She never finished high school, but she always told me that education was the only thing nobody could take away. When I heard what the Morrisons had done, how they stole from families like mine, I wanted to thank you for stopping them." After Maria left, Emma sat alone in her office as Seattle's skyline darkened outside her window. The Morrison Building still dominated the downtown landscape, though it now housed a tech company rather than the empire that had once seemed untouchable. Her phone buzzed with a text from her mother in Oregon. "Saw you on the news again. So proud of my daughter." Emma smiled, remembering the frightened young woman who had once sat in Richard Morrison's office, grateful for any opportunity and willing to overlook moral compromises for professional advancement. That woman seemed like a stranger now. The intercom crackled. "Ms. Sullivan, there's a gentleman here from the Securities and Exchange Commission. He says he has information about irregularities at Pacific Northwest Mutual. Should I send him in?" Emma straightened her shoulders, opened a fresh legal pad, and prepared to listen to another story of corporate crime that demanded justice. "Send him in," she said. Outside her window, Seattle continued its daily rhythm, a city where nobody stayed nobody forever and where some battles were worth fighting regardless of the cost. 3 years after the Morrison trial, Emma stood before a packed auditorium at Seattle University's business school, delivering the keynote address for their annual Ethics in Business Symposium. The same institution that had once seemed impossibly elite to a girl from rural Oregon now hung on her every word. "Corporate culture," she told the audience of future business leaders, "isn't created by mission statements hanging in conference rooms. It's created by what you do when nobody's watching, by whether you speak up when something's wrong, by choosing integrity over comfort." In the front row, she spotted several faces that had become familiar over the years, former Morrison and associates, employees who had found new jobs, FBI agents who had worked the case, and most surprisingly, James Whitman, the attorney who had once tried to bribe her in her apartment hallway. After her speech, Whitman approached during the reception, his expensive suit and confident demeanor unchanged, though something in his eyes suggested a different man than the one who had threatened her 3 years earlier. "Ms. Sullivan, I wanted to apologize," he said without preamble, "for what we tried to do that day, for how we approached you. I've had time to think about what you accomplished, what you represented." Emma studied his face, looking for signs of manipulation or legal strategy. "And what did I represent, Mr. Whitman?" "Proof that the system can work when someone has the courage to make it work. Proof that money and connections aren't always enough to escape consequences." He paused, seeming to weigh his words carefully. "My firm now has mandatory ethics training for all associates. We call it the Sullivan Protocol." Emma felt a mixture of surprise and satisfaction. Change, she had learned, often came in unexpected forms. The evening's most meaningful moment came later, when a young man approached her as she packed her materials. He introduced himself as Marcus Rivera, a first-year MBA student, whose scholarship had been funded by the reconstituted Morrison Family Foundation, now operated under federal oversight with complete financial transparency. "I know this might Sounds strange, Marcus said, but I wanted to thank you for destroying those people's lives. Emma raised an eyebrow. That's certainly one way to put it. My family immigrated from El Salvador when I was 8. My parents worked in restaurant kitchens, saved every dollar for my education. When I received that scholarship letter, it felt like a miracle. But knowing what we know now, knowing that the Morrisons were stealing from families like mine. His voice hardened. They deserved everything they got. That night, Emma drove through Seattle's downtown district, past the building that had once housed Morrison and Associates. The structure remained impressive, its glass facade still reflecting the city lights, but the Morrison name had been sandblasted, away, replaced by the logo of a renewable energy company that was rebuilding the space with an emphasis on transparency and ethical business practices. Her phone rang as she sat at a red light. David's voice carried excitement despite the late hour. Emma, you need to see what just came across the wire. Remember that pharmaceutical company we've been investigating? The one with the suspicious clinical trial data? Meridian Health Sciences? The FDA just raided their headquarters. Apparently, they've been falsifying drug test results for their new arthritis medication. The whistleblower was their own head of research, a woman, who said our Morrison case inspired her to come forward despite the personal cost. Emma felt the familiar surge of satisfaction that came with justice served, but also something deeper, the recognition that their work had created ripple effects beyond what they could measure. Over the following months, those ripples became a wave. The Morrison case had entered business school curricula nationwide as a study in corporate crime and the importance of ethical leadership. Emma's testimony was required viewing for new FBI financial crimes investigators. Most significantly, 3 other major corporate fraud cases in the Pacific Northwest had been cracked by whistleblowers who cited Emma's example as their inspiration. The personal cost had been significant. Emma's name was still associated with controversy in certain business circles. Job opportunities in traditional corporate settings remained limited, and she'd learned to live with the reality that some former colleagues would always see her as a traitor rather than a hero, but the benefits far outweighed the costs. Her work at the Attorney General's office had expanded into a full department with 12 investigators specializing in white-collar crime. They'd recovered over $200 million in fraudulent funds over 3 years, money that had been returned to pension funds, charitable organizations, and individual investors who had been victimized by corporate criminals. Emma's apartment had been replaced by a modest house in Capitol Hill. Nothing extravagant, but a space that felt like home in ways her old life never had. The walls were lined with thank you letters from scholarship recipients, commendations from law enforcement agencies, and photographs with the team of investigators she'd built. On the 4th anniversary of the Morrison raid, Emma received an unexpected call from Agent Martinez. Emma, I wanted to let you know before it hits the news. Richard Morrison died in federal prison last night. Heart attack, apparently. Natural causes. Emma felt no satisfaction in the news, only a quiet acknowledgement that a chapter had finally closed. Richard Morrison had served less than half his sentence, but he'd lived long enough to see his empire completely dismantled and his name become synonymous with corporate corruption. Victoria Morrison had been released 6 months earlier, her sentence reduced for cooperation with other federal investigations. She'd moved to Portland, working as a bookkeeper for a small nonprofit, a job that required her to account for every dollar and submit to regular financial audits as part of her parole conditions. That evening, Emma stood on her back deck overlooking the city that had witnessed her transformation from invisible employee to nationally recognized advocate for corporate accountability. Seattle sprawled below her, a landscape of businesses both ethical and corrupt, of dreams both realized and shattered. Her phone buzzed with a text from Maria Santos, the scholarship recipient who had visited her office years earlier. Passed. The CPA exam? Starting at the state auditor's office next month. Thanks for showing me that accounting can be about justice, not just numbers. Emma smiled, remembering her younger self. the woman who had believed that keeping her head down and accepting injustice was the price of professional survival. That woman had been wrong about many things, but she'd been right about one crucial point. Competence and integrity did matter in the business world. They mattered enough to topple empires built on lies. They mattered enough to transform nobody into somebody who could sleep soundly at night. And in a city where power and money had once seemed insurmountable, they mattered enough to prove that sometimes, just sometimes, the good guys actually win. Emma's alarm clock buzzed at 5:30 a.m., the same time it had for the past decade. But instead of rising to review case files in her Capitol Hill home, she now stood on the deck of a cabin overlooking Puget Sound, watching the sunrise paint the Olympic Mountains in shades of gold and rose. At 42, she had learned that some battles were worth fighting, and some peaceful moments were worth protecting. The Washington State Attorney General had appointed her as the first director of the Pacific Northwest Corporate Accountability Initiative 3 years earlier, a regional task force spanning Washington, Oregon, and Northern California. The position allowed her to work remotely while coordinating investigations across 3 states, pursuing the kind of complex, multi-jurisdictional cases that had once seemed impossible for local prosecutors. Her phone buzzed with a text from David, now her deputy director. Portland case broke wide open. CFO ready to flip on the whole procurement fraud scheme. 40 malwars recovered so far. Emma smiled, pouring her coffee as she composed her reply. 10. Years of partnership had taught them to communicate in shorthand, their professional relationship having evolved into something resembling a family business. If the family business happened to be dismantling corporate criminal enterprises. The sound of footsteps on the wooden deck interrupted her morning routine. Thomas Chen, Marcus's younger brother and Emma's partner for the past 4 years, emerged from the cabin carrying 2 steaming mugs and wearing the expression of someone who'd been monitoring overnight news feeds. The Morrison documentary is trending again, he said, settling beside her on the wooden bench they'd built together the previous summer. Apparently, it's required viewing in half the business schools in the country now. Emma had initially resisted the documentary, filmmakers' requests for interviews, uncomfortable with the attention that still followed her a decade after the original case, but the finished product had exceeded her expectations. A nuanced examination of corporate corruption and the personal cost of challenging institutional power. More importantly, it had inspired a new generation of potential whistleblowers who understood that speaking truth to power was both possible and necessary. Any regrets? Thomas asked, a question that had become their morning ritual. Only that it took me so long to find my voice, Emma replied, the same answer she'd given for 3 years running. The cabin had been purchased with money from Emma's book advance, a memoir that had surprised everyone, including her publisher, by becoming a bestseller. Nobody's Daughter, How I Brought Down Seattle's Most Powerful Family, had spent 14 weeks on the New York Times list. But more importantly, it had generated speaking fees that allowed Emma to establish the Sullivan Foundation for Corporate Whistleblowers, providing legal and financial support for employees brave enough to expose corporate crimes. Her phone rang, displaying a familiar number. Good morning, Maria. Maria Santos, now Dr. Maria Santos, having completed her PhD in forensic accounting, called every few months with updates on her work at the Federal Trade Commission. Her specialty was healthcare fraud, particularly schemes that targeted low-income communities, and her success rate for prosecutions had made her a legend among white-collar crime investigators. Emma, I wanted to give you a heads up before the announcement goes public. We just wrapped up the biggest Medicare fraud case in FTC history, $230 million stolen from elderly patients' treatments. The whistleblower was a nurse who cited your Morrison case as her inspiration. She said if somebody from a trailer park in Oregon could take down the Morrisons, she could expose the criminals stealing from her patients. After ending the call, Emma found herself reflecting on the unexpected ways that courage multiplied. The Morrison case had been deeply personal, an act of individual defiance against specific tormentors. But its influence had spread far beyond her original intentions, creating a network of accountability that spanned industries and states. David arrived at the cabin around noon, carrying boxes of files for their weekly strategy session. At 58, he'd evolved from reluctant IT director to one of the West Coast's most feared forensic investigators, his ability to trace digital, financial crimes having made him a consultant for federal agencies nationwide. "Before we dive into the Portland case," he said, setting down his materials, "I have something to show you." He produced a printed email from his briefcase. "This came through the Sullivan Foundation tip line yesterday. A software engineer at a major defense contractor thinks her company is inflating costs on government contracts. Hundreds of millions in taxpayer money, potentially." Emma read the email twice, recognizing the familiar mixture of moral outrage and professional fear that had once paralyzed her own decision-making. The engineer, Jennifer Walsh, described watching her supervisors manipulate billing systems while knowing that speaking up could end her career and jeopardize her family's financial security. "What did you tell her?" "That someone from our team would be in touch within 48 hours, that she wouldn't face this alone." David paused, studying Emma's expression. "I also told her about a young accountant who once sat in a similar position, terrified of challenging powerful people but ultimately deciding that some principles were worth the risk." That afternoon, Emma placed the call to Jennifer Walsh herself. The conversation lasted 2 hours, covering everything from evidence preservation to legal protections for whistleblowers. But mostly, Emma listened as Jennifer wrestled with the same questions that had once kept Emma awake at night. Was her career worth preserving at the cost of her integrity? Could one person really make a difference against institutional corruption? What happened to people who challenged systems more powerful than themselves? "The truth is," Emma told Jennifer near the end of their conversation, "I can't promise that everything will work out perfectly. There will be professional consequences, personal costs, moments when you'll question whether it was worth it. But I can promise that you'll be able to look at yourself in the mirror without shame. And I can promise that you won't face this fight alone." After the call, Emma stood on her deck again, watching the ferry traffic cross Puget Sound in the fading afternoon light. Thomas found her there an hour later, lost in thought. "Another one?" he asked. "Another one," Emma confirmed. "Defense. Contractor fraud, potentially bigger than anything we've handled." "Are you ready for that kind of case again? The media attention, the legal battles, the death threats from people who think you're destroying American business?" Emma considered the question seriously. At 42, she had achieved a level of professional security and personal peace that would have seemed impossible during her Morrison and Associates days. She owned her home, had meaningful work, and had built relationships based on mutual respect rather than professional necessity. She could easily refer Jennifer Walsh to other investigators and maintain her comfortable distance from the front lines of corporate accountability. But comfort, she had learned, was often the enemy of justice. "I became somebody by refusing to stay nobody," Emma said finally. "Jennifer Walsh deserves the same chance." As Seattle's skyline began to twinkle in the distance, Emma felt the familiar surge of purpose that had sustained her through a decade of battles against corporate corruption. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new criminals to expose, new victims to protect. Tonight, she would simply enjoy the peace she had earned, and the knowledge that choosing courage over comfort had transformed not only her own life, but the lives of countless others who had found their own voices by watching her find hers. In the end, that was the only legacy that mattered. 15 years after the Morrison case, Emma stood in the marble rotunda of the Washington state capitol, surrounded by legislators, journalists, and advocates who had gathered to witness the signing of the Corporate Accountability Reform Act. Governor Patricia Yamamoto held the ceremonial pen, but Emma knew that the real power belonged to the grassroots movement that had made this moment possible. This legislation, the governor announced to the assembled crowd, ensures that corporate whistleblowers receive the strongest legal protections in the nation. It establishes mandatory reporting requirements for financial irregularities and creates the Emma Sullivan Corporate Ethics Institute, funded by recovered assets from white-collar crime prosecutions. Emma felt a familiar mixture of pride and discomfort at hearing her name attached to an institution. At 47, she had reluctantly accepted that her story had become larger than her personal experience, transformed into a symbol of individual courage against institutional corruption. The ceremony concluded with handshakes and photographs, but Emma's attention was drawn to a young woman standing at the edge of the crowd. She appeared to be in her early 20s, professionally dressed but with the nervous energy of someone carrying a heavy burden. "Ms. Sullivan?" The woman approached hesitantly. "I'm Sarah Kim. I work for Cascade Biotech. I've been following your career since I was in high school. I wonder if I could speak with you privately." Emma recognized the tone immediately, the same mixture of determination and fear that had once paralyzed her own decision-making. They found a quiet corner of the rotunda, away from the celebration. "What's happening at Cascade?" Emma asked. Gently, Sarah's story unfolded with devastating clarity. Cascade Biotech had been fast-tracking experimental cancer treatments through FDA approval by manipulating clinical trial data. Patients who had experienced severe side effects were being excluded from reports, while others who had shown no improvement were being listed as treatment successes. "I'm just a data analyst," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I've seen the real numbers. The treatment they're about to release could kill people. The only reason it's getting approved is because my supervisors are lying to the FDA." Emma listened without interruption, remembering her own terror at the prospect of challenging powerful interests. But she also recognized something else in Sarah's voice, the same moral clarity that had ultimately driven her to expose the Morrison crimes. "How many patients are we talking about?" Emma asked. "The drug will be prescribed to approximately 15,000 cancer patients in the first year alone. If the real side effect profile matches what I've seen in the suppressed data..." Sarah's voice broke. "We're talking about potentially hundreds of deaths that could be prevented." Emma felt the familiar surge of righteous anger that had sustained her through 15 years of battles against corporate corruption. But she also felt something new, the weight of responsibility that came with being someone others turned to for guidance. "Sarah, I need you to understand what you're contemplating. Cascade Biotech has resources that dwarf what the Morrisons ever had. They'll come after you with everything: private investigators, character assassination, lawsuits designed to bankrupt you. Your career in biotech will be over." "I know," Sarah replied immediately. "But I became a scientist to help people, not to watch them die for corporate profits." Emma studied the young woman's face, seeing echoes of her own younger self, but also recognizing crucial differences. Sarah had sought her out proactively, had done her research, had prepared for the consequences. She wasn't driven by personal humiliation or revenge, but by pure moral conviction. "If you're determined to do this," Emma said carefully, "you'll need more than just good intentions. You'll need strategy, legal protection, and evidence that can't be dismissed or explained away." Over the next 3 hours, Emma walked Sarah through the process she had learned over 15 years of corporate investigations. They discussed evidence preservation, legal protections, media strategy, and the personal support systems that would be essential during the inevitable counterattack. "The Sullivan Foundation will provide legal representation and financial support," Emma explained. "But the emotional cost is something you'll have to manage yourself. There will be nights when you question everything, when you wonder if it was worth destroying your career to save people you'll never meet." "How do you handle those moments?" Sarah asked. Emma considered the question, thinking of the hundreds of cases she had worked, the thousands of people who had been helped by recovered funds, the dozens of young investigators who had followed her path into corporate accountability work. "I remember that staying silent makes me complicit," she said finally. "I remember that my comfort isn't worth more than someone else's life. And I remember that I once thought I was nobody, that my voice didn't matter. Proving that wrong has been the most important work of my life." 6 months later, Emma stood in another federal courthouse, this time in San Francisco, watching Sarah Kim testify about Cascade Biotech's fraudulent clinical trials. The case had exploded into national headlines when the FDA had halted approval of the cancer drug just days before its scheduled release, potentially saving thousands of lives. Sarah's testimony was devastating in its precision and unshakable in its moral authority. She had documented everything: the suppressed data, the manipulated reports, the emails discussing how to minimize problematic patient outcomes. When Cascade's attorneys attempted to discredit her, Sarah responded with the quiet confidence of someone who had chosen principle over personal advancement. "I became a scientist to help people fight cancer," Sarah told the jury. "I couldn't stand by and watch my company turn that mission into a lie." The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Cascade Biotech's executives were convicted on multiple counts of fraud, while the company was ordered to pay $400 million in fines and restitution. The cancer drug was permanently banned from the market. That evening, Emma and Sarah shared dinner at a small restaurant overlooking San Francisco Bay. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the lights of the city reflect on the water. "Any regrets?" Emma asked, echoing the question Thomas had posed to her for years. "Only that I didn't act sooner," Sarah replied. "How many patients were harmed while I was building up the courage to speak out?" Emma recognized the burden of retrospective guilt that haunted every whistleblower, the knowledge that earlier action might have prevented additional harm. But she also recognized the unfairness of that self-judgment. "You acted when you were ready to act effectively," Emma said. "Timing matters in these cases. If you had spoken up before gathering sufficient evidence, they would have buried you and continued their crimes. You saved lives, Sarah. That's what matters." As they parted ways outside the restaurant, Sarah turned back with a question that caught Emma off guard. "Do you think it ever ends? The corruption? The need for people to risk everything to expose it?" Emma considered the question, thinking of Jennifer Walsh's defense contractor case, of the dozen other investigations currently underway, of the new corporate ethics institute that would train the next generation of accountability professionals. "I don't think it ends," she said honestly. "But I think it changes. Every case we win, every criminal we expose, every law we change makes it a little harder for the next group of corporate criminals to operate. We're not trying to eliminate corruption. We're trying to make it expensive and dangerous enough that fewer people choose it." Walking back to her hotel, Emma felt the satisfaction that came with another successful case, but also the weight of ongoing responsibility. In her pocket, her phone buzzed with messages from 3 potential new whistleblowers who had been inspired by Sarah's courage. The work continued. The fight evolved. And somewhere in America, another young person was discovering that nobody had to stay nobody forever. That sometimes the most powerful force in the world was someone willing to stand up and tell the truth, regardless of the consequences. Emma Sullivan had learned that lesson in a Seattle conference room 15 years earlier. Now she spent her days teaching it to others, one case at a time, one life at a time, one act of courage at a time. It was, she reflected, the only work that had ever truly mattered. The auditorium buzzed with the energy of 500 corporate compliance officers, ethics lawyers, and accountability advocates. Emma stood at the podium, no longer the trembling analyst who had once sat in her cubicle wondering if she had the courage to speak up. The woman addressing the National Corporate Accountability Conference wore confidence like armor. her voice carrying the weight of experience and the authority of someone who had walked through fire and emerged stronger. 5 years ago, I was... You, she began, her gaze sweeping across the audience. I was someone who discovered something wrong and faced the hardest question any of us will ever confront. Do I speak up, knowing it might cost me everything? Or do I stay silent and become complicit in the very corruption I swore to prevent? A young woman in the third row leaned forward, her eyes locked on Emma's face with desperate intensity. Emma had seen that look before, in her own mirror, years ago. The path of a whistleblower is never easy, Emma continued. But here's what I've learned. Individual courage doesn't just change companies. It changes systems. It changes culture. And most importantly, it changes the people who come after us. The applause was thunderous, but Emma's attention remained fixed on the young woman in the third row, who was now wiping tears from her eyes. After the speech, Emma wasn't surprised when the woman approached her at the book-signing table. She was barely 25, with the haunted look of someone carrying a terrible secret. "Ms. Chen," she whispered, leaning across the table. "I'm Sarah Martinez. I work for North Star Financial Group, and I think I've found something. Something big." Emma's blood chilled. North Star was one of the firms that had emerged from the ashes of the Morrison Group network, staffed by many of the same players who had escaped prosecution. She'd been watching them for years, waiting for the inevitable. "Tell me," Emma said simply. Sarah glanced around nervously. "Not here. Please, can we meet somewhere private?" 2 hours later, they sat in Emma's hotel suite, Sarah's documents spread across the coffee table like accusations. The patterns were eerily familiar. Shell companies, manipulated earnings, regulatory capture. It was Morrison Group all over again, just with different names and more sophisticated methods. "They're using artificial intelligence to hide the transactions now," Sarah explained, her voice shaking. "The algorithms are so complex that traditional auditing can't catch them. But I found the source code. I know how they're doing it." Emma studied the young woman's face, seeing herself at 28, terrified but determined. "Sarah, do you understand what you're holding? Evidence of maybe $2 billion in fraud across multiple companies." "No," Emma said gently. "You're holding the next evolution of corporate fraud, and you're the only person positioned to stop it." Sarah's hands trembled as she reached for her water glass. "I can't do this alone. I've read about what happened to you, the isolation, the retaliation. I don't have your strength." "You have something better," Emma replied. "You have support. You have systems that didn't exist when I blew the whistle. And you have people like me who've walked this path and can guide you through it." Over the next 3 days, Emma canceled all her appointments to work with Sarah. They crafted the disclosure strategy, identified the key evidence, and built the safety net that Emma had desperately needed 5 years earlier. The Richardson Foundation provided legal support, while Emma's compliance firm offered technical expertise. Marcus found Emma in her office at midnight on the 3rd day, surrounded by printouts and coffee cups. "You know this could destroy everything." "We've built," he said, settling into the chair across from her desk. "North Star has connections everywhere. Taking them on could bring down half the reform movement." Emma looked up from the financial statements she was analyzing. "Then we rebuild it. That's what we do, Marcus. We keep building until the system can't be corrupted anymore." He smiled, the expression soft with admiration and something deeper. "Marry me." The words hung in the air between them, as unexpected as they were perfect. "What?" "Marry me," he repeated, leaning forward. "Not because of some grand romantic gesture or perfect timing. Marry me because I want to spend my life fighting these battles beside you. Marry me because when you get that look in your eyes, the One you have right now when you're about to take on impossible odds for the right reasons. I want to be the person who gets to support you through it. Emma set down her pen, studying his face. Are you proposing to me in the middle of the biggest case we've ever taken on? I'm proposing to you because of it. Because this is who you are, Emma. This is who we are together. And I don't want to wait for a convenient moment that might never come. She stood up, walked around the desk, and kissed him. Yes, she whispered against his lips. But after we take down North Star. The case broke 6 months later, just as Emma and Marcus were exchanging vows in a small ceremony overlooking the Pacific. The timing was coincidental but symbolic. As they pledged their lives to each other, federal agents were executing search warrants across 3 states. The guest list was small but meaningful. David Richardson served as Marcus's best man, having become both mentor and father figure to Emma over the years. Janet Patterson, now running her own boutique investigation firm, caught the bouquet with characteristic precision. But the biggest surprise came during the reception, when Victoria Morrison approached Emma's table. I wasn't sure I should come, Victoria said, and Emma barely recognized her. Gone was the polished corporate warrior who had tried to destroy her. This woman wore simple clothes and carried herself with quiet humility. But I wanted to thank you. Thank me for saving my life. Victoria's voice was steady, but her eyes were bright with unshed tears. The counselor at the rehabilitation center said you visited me every week while I was unconscious. Even after everything I did to you, Emma nodded. You were sick, Victoria, and you were alone. I've been sober for 4 years now. I'm working as an addiction counselor, helping other executives who've lost themselves in the pressure and the pills. Victoria paused, gathering courage. I testified to the Senate committee about the culture at Morrison Group, about how we created environments that rewarded corruption and punished conscience. I wanted you to know that your courage didn't just expose the fraud, it saved the people, who were drowning in it. Before Emma could respond, Victoria had melted back into the crowd, leaving behind only the scent of hope and redemption. The final surprise came during the dancing. Marcus was spinning Emma across the floor when David approached with a letter. This came for you yesterday, he said. I thought you should see it. The return address made Emma's breath catch. Federal. Correctional Institution, Terminal Island, James Morrison. She opened it with trembling hands. Dear Ms. Chen, I write this knowing I have no right to your attention or your forgiveness. But as I sit in this cell, serving the 15-year sentence, your courage made possible, I find myself compelled to acknowledge something I should have said long ago. You were right, not just about the numbers or the fraud, but about what we had become. In our pursuit of profit, we lost sight of the people whose lives we affected, our employees, our investors, the communities that trusted us. We became so focused on winning that we forgot what we were supposed to be playing for. Your decision to speak up didn't just expose our crimes, it reminded an entire industry of its obligations. I read the papers, Ms. Chen. I see the changes happening, the new regulations, the whistleblower protections, the cultural shifts in how corporations approach compliance. My daughter Victoria tells me about her work with executives struggling with the pressures that once consumed us both. I will never see freedom again, and that is justice. But I wanted you to know that your courage created something beautiful from the ashes of our corruption. You didn't just stop us, you started something better. With profound respect and gratitude, James Morrison. Emma folded the letter carefully, her eyes blurring with tears that held no sadness, only the complex emotions of closure and vindication. Good news? Marcus asked softly. The best kind, she replied. The kind that reminds you why the fight is worth it. 2 years later, Emma stood before another audience. But this one was different. These weren't seasoned compliance officers or battle-hardened investigators. These were students, 20 bright-eyed graduate students in her corporate ethics and accountability seminar at Stanford Business School. "Before we begin today's case study," she said, walking among their desks, "I want you to consider something. Each of you will graduate and enter organizations where you'll have power, over budgets, over people, over information. And at some point, you'll face a moment when doing the right thing conflicts with doing the profitable thing, the easy thing, or the career-advancing thing." She paused beside Sarah Martinez, who had returned to school after her testimony helped convict 14 North Star executives. Sarah was now one of Emma's most dedicated protégés, planning to start her own compliance consultancy after graduation. "What will you do in that moment?" Emma continued. "Will you have the systems in place to support ethical action? Will you have the courage to act on your convictions? And most importantly, will you remember that your choice in that moment doesn't just affect you, it affects everyone who comes after you?" A young man in the back row raised his hand. "Professor Chen, what if we're not strong enough? What if we don't have your courage?" Emma smiled, thinking of Victoria's transformation, of Sarah's determination, of the hundreds of whistleblowers the Richardson Foundation had supported over the years. "Courage isn't something you're born with," she said. "It's something you practice. It's something you build, case by case, decision by decision. And here's the secret. You're never as alone as you think you are. Every person who chooses integrity over convenience makes it easier for the next person to make the same choice." She walked to the whiteboard and wrote a single word: legacy. "This is what I want you to remember from this class. Your legacy isn't just what you accomplish, it's what you make possible for others. When you choose courage, you don't just change your own story, you change the story of everyone who follows." As the students filed out after class, discussing the day's lesson with animated voices, Emma gathered her materials slowly. Through the window, she could see the Stanford campus buzzing with young energy and ambition. Somewhere among those students were the future leaders who would face the same moral crucibles she had encountered. But they wouldn't face them alone. Sarah lingered behind, as she often did. "Professor Chen, I got a call today. Another analyst, this time at a healthcare company. She found evidence of price fixing on cancer medications." Emma looked up, seeing the fire in Sarah's eyes that had once burned in her own. "What did you tell her?" "That she wasn't alone, that we'd help her through it, that speaking up isn't just about stopping the wrongdoing, it's about changing the system so that wrongdoing becomes impossible." Emma smiled, feeling the deep satisfaction of a mission that had grown beyond her wildest dreams. "Then you've learned the most important lesson of all." As Sarah left to catch her next class, Emma sat alone in the empty classroom, surrounded by the quiet evidence of education and hope. On her desk sat a photo from her wedding day. Marcus laughing as they cut the cake, David beaming with paternal pride, even Victoria smiling genuinely in the background. But it was the stack of thank you letters beside the photo that truly measured. Her legacy. Letters from whistleblowers who had found their courage through her example. Letters from compliance officers whose programs had prevented millions in fraud. Letters from executives who had chosen transparency over deception because they had learned that integrity was not just morally right, but practically sustainable. The fight was far from over. There would always be new forms of corruption, new challenges to ethical leadership, new moments when someone would need to choose between right and profitable. But Emma had learned that the fight itself was the victory. Every person who chose courage made the next choice easier. Every voice that spoke up made the next voice stronger. As she packed her briefcase and prepared to head home to Marcus and the quiet satisfaction of a life lived with purpose, Emma Chen, former whistleblower, current professor, eternal advocate for justice, smiled at the knowledge that her story was no longer just her own. It belonged to everyone brave enough to continue it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe. And turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.